I haven't read the transcript file yet, which is essential for analyzing the original story structure, emotional beats, and pacing before writing a new version. Let me read it first. Now I have everything I need. Writing the new story directly. The night I turned 72, my son-in-law handed me a birthday card with a gold envelope and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I remember thinking how much effort that must take. 30 years of marriage to my daughter, and he still hadn't figured out how to make a smile look real. I didn't say anything. I just thanked him and put the card on the mantel next to the photograph of my late wife, Ellen. That was 8 months ago. By then, I had already been watching him for 6 weeks. My name is Walter Drummond. I'm 73 years old. I spent 41 years running a mid-sized structural engineering firm out of Kitchener, Ontario. Drummond and Associates. We designed bridges, overpasses, a handful of federal infrastructure projects that I'm still quietly proud of. Last spring, I sold the firm to a larger company out of Toronto for just under $31 million. I was ready to be done. My knees were tired, my back was tired, and without Ellen beside me, the office felt like a building I was renting from someone else. What I was not ready for was what came next. It started the way these things always do. Slowly, quietly, dressed up in the language of love. My daughter Nadia had been married to her husband Spencer for 9 years. On paper, Spencer Harlow was an impressive man. 44 years old, financial consultant, offices in Waterloo and downtown Toronto. He drove a Porsche Cayenne and wore shirts with French cuffs, and talked about interest rates and emerging markets the way other men talked about hockey. He had never once, in 9 years, asked me a single question about my life. I had chalked that up to personality. Some men are simply not curious people. But the month after the sale of my firm closed, Spencer's interest in me increased dramatically. He started calling. Not Nadia calling to check on her father the way she always had, but Spencer picking up the phone himself, asking about my health, my plans, whether I had thought about what I was going to do with all that liquidity sitting in a bank account. He used the word liquidity 3 times in the first phone call. I counted. "Walter," he said, in that measured, reasonable voice of his, $31 million in a standard investment account is essentially losing money. You need active management from someone who understands the current market environment. I manage portfolios for clients with far more complex situations than yours. Let me help you. I told him I appreciated it and I'd think about it. I called my solicitor the following morning. Ray Kowalski had been my lawyer since the mid-90s. He was a compact, unhurried man from Guelph who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. I had called him with stranger requests over the years. He listened without interrupting while I told him what Spencer had said, and then he was quiet for a moment. "You want me to look into him," Ray said. "I want you to look into him," I confirmed. 2 weeks later, Ray came to my house with a manila folder and a grim expression. We sat at the kitchen table, where Ellen and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 34 years, and he spread the documents out in front of me. Spencer Harlow's consulting practice had 3 registered clients. He had started it 11 years ago, with financing from an undisclosed private source. His disclosed income, according to documents Ray's investigator had obtained through legitimate channels, was approximately $140,000 a year. His lifestyle, however, the Porsche, the Muskoka cottage he and Nadia rented every August, the private school tuition he was already researching for the children they didn't yet have, suggested a gap between what he made and what he spent. A significant gap. Ray set a bank statement in front of me. "He has a line of credit against the equity in their house," he said. "Nadia's on the mortgage, but she doesn't appear to know about the line of credit. It's been drawn down to just under $400,000. I stared at the number. "How? Gradually," Ray said. "The way it always is." There was more. Spencer had a brother named Alistair, 2 years younger, a civil litigation lawyer based in Hamilton. On the surface, Alistair's practice was legitimate. But Ray's investigator had found something interesting buried in Alistair's recent case history. 3 guardianship applications in the past 4 years. All 3 involved elderly clients whose family members claimed they were no longer competent to manage their own affairs. In all 3 cases, control of the client's assets had transferred to a family member within 6 months of the application. "Elder law," Ray said quietly. "That's Alistair's specialty." I sat back in my chair. The window above the sink looked out onto the backyard where Ellen's garden had gone to seed over the past 2 winters. I hadn't had the heart to replant it. "They're planning to have me declared incompetent," I said. It was not a question. Ray nodded. "That's my read. Spencer has the motive. He needs access to significant capital before his creditors come looking. Alistair has the mechanism. All they need is an opportunity. And a reason," I said. "A reason for a judge to believe I can't manage my own affairs," which they would create, Ray said. "These cases typically involve some kind of documented incident. A public episode where the target appears confused or disoriented. Witnesses who can speak to a pattern of declining cognition." I thought about that for a long moment. I thought about Ellen, who had died 2 years ago of pancreatic cancer, and who had always said that Spencer was pleasant, but that pleasant was not the same thing as good. She had an eye for that distinction. I thought about Nadia, who had her mother's laugh and her mother's stubbornness, and who had spent 9 years building a life with a man who was planning to use her to steal from her father. "All right," I said to Ray. "Tell me what we need to do." The plan was straightforward, if uncomfortable. I would begin exhibiting signs of cognitive decline, subtle at first, then gradually more pronounced: forgotten appointments, confused phone calls, misplaced objects. Spencer and Alistair needed to believe the window was opening. We needed them to move. Ray brought in a private security firm out of Mississauga, 2 former OPP officers who specialized in surveillance. They installed cameras throughout my house, with my full knowledge and consent, properly documented to meet the evidentiary standards required by Ontario courts. They monitored Spencer's communications through legal means, tracing phone calls he made from my driveway, flagging messages sent through channels he thought were private. For 6 weeks, I played the part. I called Nadia and forgot what I had called about. I showed up at Spencer and Nadia's house for dinner on the wrong night and stood on their porch looking bewildered while Spencer let me in with barely concealed satisfaction. I accidentally left a voicemail for Ray's office in which I sounded confused about the status of my estate, a voicemail Ray confirmed Spencer had obtained through means that were themselves now part of the evidence file. It was the loneliest 6 weeks of my life. Not because I was frightened, but because I had to watch my daughter look at me with real worry in her eyes and say nothing to reassure her. I had to let her believe the lie, because if she knew the truth, Spencer might find out, and I needed Spencer to be certain. It was late October when Ray told me they were ready to move. Spencer had been in contact with a Dr. Gerald Finch, a retired psychiatrist from Burlington, whose license had been suspended 18 months earlier following an investigation by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. Finch had a history of providing professional assessments for legal proceedings that were, to put it generously, outcomes-oriented. Spencer had paid Finch $8,000 via an intermediary company. We had documentation of the transfer. Alistair had prepared the guardianship application. It named Spencer as proposed guardian of my person and property. It listed 14 separate incidents of apparent cognitive decline, several of which Ray's investigators had themselves been present to witness and could testify had been staged. The opportunity they chose was Remembrance Day. I had hosted a dinner at my house every November 11th for as long as I could remember. Old colleagues, neighbors, a few veterans from Ellen's father's regiment, who were still around and who I had continued to invite after his passing. It was the kind of evening that would have witnesses, respectable witnesses, people whose accounts would carry weight. Spencer arrived first 40 minutes before the other guests. He said he wanted to help set up. I thanked him and showed him to the kitchen and went back to the living room to adjust the table settings. I positioned myself so I could see the kitchen doorway in the reflection of the dark window above the fireplace. I watched him take a small prescription bottle from his jacket pocket. I watched him open the bottle and tap 3 tablets into his palm. I watched him crush them carefully against the counter using the back of a spoon, dissolve the powder in a glass, and add bourbon from my good bottle on the shelf. I had been expecting it. Ray had warned me, and still, watching a man prepare something like that in the kitchen, where I had cooked breakfast for my children every Saturday morning for 20 years, that was a feeling I am not going to try to describe in a way that sounds measured or calm, because it wasn't. I took a breath. I walked into the kitchen. "Spencer," I said, Would you mind checking on the side table in the study? I think I may have left my reading glasses out there, and I don't want one of the guests to knock them off." He smiled. "Of course, Walter. Happy to help." He went to the study. I picked up the prepared glass and set it at the place where Alistair was going to be sitting. Alistair, who had come to the dinner as well, who had driven up from Hamilton, and who was standing out in the front hall taking off his coat. I replaced my spot with an untouched glass from the cabinet. Spencer came back from the study with my reading glasses, which I had placed there myself that afternoon. "Found them," he said cheerfully. "Thank you," I said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The dinner started at 6. 11 guests around my dining room table. Old friends, former colleagues. My neighbor Margaret Hollis, who had been bringing me casseroles since Ellen died. A retired brigadier general named Don, who had known my father-in-law, and who still wore his poppy 3 days after Remembrance Day, because he said you couldn't remember long enough. Alistair was midway through his first glass when he went quiet. He had been animated, holding court at his end of the table, telling some story about a case he had won against the city of Hamilton. And then he simply stopped. He put his hand on the table, as if to steady himself. His eyes went to the ceiling and then back down, and his expression shifted from the performance of confidence to something unguarded and afraid. "Alistair?" Spencer said, his voice careful. "I feel strange," Alistair said. "I feel—" He didn't finish the sentence. He slumped sideways in his chair, and Don, who had military field training and the reflexes to match, caught him before he hit the floor. The room erupted the way rooms do. I did not move from my seat. I sat very still and I looked at Spencer. His face had gone the color of old chalk. He was looking at his brother and then at me, and then at his brother again, and I could see him trying to reconstruct the sequence of events, trying to understand what had gone wrong. He looked at the glass in front of me, untouched. He looked at the glass in front of where Alistair had been sitting, empty. I watched the understanding arrive on his face the way weather arrives over the lake, slow at first, then all at once, and there is nothing you can do about it. "Call 911, Don said, already unbuttoning Alistair's collar. "Now, somebody call." I called myself. My voice was steady. The dispatcher said 7 minutes. Spencer had not moved. He was standing behind his chair with his hands gripping the back of it, knuckles white. Everyone else in the room was focused on Alistair. Everyone except me. "Spencer," I said, quietly enough that only he could hear. He looked at me. "You might want to sit down," I said. "It's going to be a long night." The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. They stabilized Alistair on my dining room floor, administered activated charcoal, and had him on a stretcher and out the door in 12 minutes. I later learned the drug had been a sedative compound, not intended to kill, intended to incapacitate, to produce the kind of disoriented, uncoordinated episode that would look, at a dinner party, like a man having a sudden medical crisis. The dosage Alistair received had been meant for me. The police arrived shortly after the ambulance. 2 officers from Waterloo Regional at first, followed within an hour by a detective named Tran from the Major Crime Unit, who had been pre-briefed by Ray's office and was expecting the call. They interviewed the guests. They interviewed Spencer. They interviewed me last. I told Detective Tran what I had observed from the kitchen doorway reflection. I told her about the bottle, the tablets, the spoon. I told her about the glass switch. She took notes in a small spiral book and did not change her expression once. "Mr. Drummond," she said, when I had finished, "you're telling me you've been surveilling your son-in-law for approximately 2 months and deliberately staged a situation in which you anticipated he would attempt to drug you. I'm telling you." "He drugged a glass he believed I was going to drink from," I said. "What I did with that glass afterward is what any reasonable man would do when he becomes aware that someone has tampered with his drink." She looked at me for a long moment. "You were never actually at risk." "No," I said, "but everything he intended to do to me is in the file my solicitor has prepared for your unit. I'd suggest you start with the guardianship application." She did. The arrests came on a Friday morning, 11 days after the dinner. Spencer was taken from his office in Waterloo. Alistair, who had been released from hospital after 2 days and had not yet been told the full picture, was arrested at his home in Hamilton. Dr. Gerald Finch was arrested at his condo in Burlington at 7:15 in the morning, while he was apparently in the middle of making oatmeal. Ray was with me when we got the confirmation call. We were sitting in my kitchen with coffee. "It's done," he said. I nodded. I looked out the window at Ellen's garden. "Not yet," I said. Nadia had known that something had happened at the dinner. She had not been there. Spencer had told her the dinner was small, just old colleagues, not her crowd. And she found out from Margaret Hollis, who had called her the next morning, distressed, to say that her uncle had collapsed and the police had come. Nadia had called me in a panic, and I had told her I was fine, that there had been an incident, that I would explain everything soon. I had not explained anything yet. The morning after the arrests, I drove to her house. She opened the door in her work clothes, halfway through getting ready, her hair still pinned. When she saw my face, she said, "Dad, what is it? Tell me right now." I told her, all of it. I sat at her kitchen table, the same kind of ordinary kitchen table that is the site of every important conversation families ever have, and I laid it out from the beginning. The financial investigation, the surveillance, the guardianship application with her husband's name on it, the video of Spencer in my kitchen, the glass. She did not say anything for a long time. "He told me you were getting confused," she said finally. "He said he was worried about you, that you had called him twice in 1 week not remembering you had already called, that you'd shown up at our house on the wrong night." "I know," I said. I believed him. Her voice was careful and flat in the way voices get when the emotion underneath is too large to let out all at once. I went along with the psychiatrist appointment he was suggesting. I told myself I was being a good daughter. "You were being a good wife," I said. "To a man who was giving you false information, I should have talked to you directly." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I should have talked to you." "Yes," I said, "but so should I have. I was trying to protect you from something that was also happening to you. That was wrong of me. I'm sorry." She looked up. Her eyes were her mother's eyes, that same particular gray that goes very dark when she is trying not to cry. "Was any of it real?" she said. 9 years. Was any of it real with him? I did not know how to answer that. I did not know the interior of Spencer Harlow's heart. If he had loved my daughter in some complicated way alongside using her, if the calculation had been there from the start, or had crept in gradually as his debts mounted. I told her I didn't know. I told her that what I did know was that she was real, that the life she had built for herself was real, that the qualities in her that I loved, her precision, her stubbornness, her inability to let an unfair thing go unaddressed, were hers and no one could take them. She nodded for a while. Then she said, "I want to see all the documents. I'll have Ray send everything over this afternoon. I want to understand exactly what he was planning to do to you." She said it the way she used to say things as a child when she had decided something. Settled. No room for negotiation. "I want to understand all of it." "All right," I said. "And then," she said, "I'm going to need a good divorce lawyer." The trials took 14 months in total, spread across 2 jurisdictions due to the Hamilton component. Spencer was convicted of criminal fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. He had briefly managed a small account of mine before I quietly froze access, and conspiracy to administer a noxious substance. The judge, a small, precise woman from Kitchener, who seemed to regard the defense's arguments with something close to personal offense, sentenced him to 11 years. Alistair, who had hired aggressive counsel and argued he had no knowledge of the drugging, was contradicted by a series of text messages recovered from his phone in which he and Spencer had discussed, with specific clinical detail, which sedative compound would produce the most convincing presentation of a sudden medical emergency in an elderly man. He received 8 years. Gerald Finch, in exchange for testimony, pleaded guilty to fraud and was sentenced to 3 years. I attended every day of Spencer's trial. I sat in the second row with Ray beside me, and I watched Spencer's lawyers try to construct a version of events in which everything had been a misunderstanding, a concern for my well-being that had been poorly expressed, an error of judgment that did not rise to criminal intent. I watched Spencer nod along to these arguments with practiced sincerity, and I thought about Nadia, sitting at his kitchen table, believing she was a good wife. When the verdict came, Spencer looked at me. I did not look away. Nadia did not attend the trial. She had made that decision early, and I respected it. She said she did not want to spend 14 months watching lawyers argue about the value of her marriage. She had things to do. She was not wrong. In the first year after the arrest, she filed for divorce, returned to a landscape architecture practice, She had left 4 years earlier when Spencer said her income was unnecessary and began running again in the mornings along the trail that follows the Speed River through town. I saw her twice a week for dinner. She ate more than she had in years. She laughed at things that were actually funny, not at the things Spencer had signaled should be laughed at. One evening in the spring, she said to me, "Do you know what the strangest part is? Tell me." I feel relieved. She shook her head. My marriage collapsed and my husband went to prison, and I feel like I can breathe for the first time in years. What does that say about how I was living? It says you're paying attention now, I said. That's all. She looked at her hands. I keep thinking about Mum, about what she would say. Your mother, I said, would say that you wasted 9 years on a man who wasn't worth 9 months, and then she would tell you to stop thinking about it and plant something. Nadia laughed. A real one, the kind that catches in the throat. That is exactly what she would say. After the trials, Ray and I spent several months talking about what to do next. I was not interested in simply managing money. Ellen had raised our children with a strict orientation toward utility, toward the idea that the point of having resources was to use them well. I felt the weight of that. We established the Drummond Elder Protection Fund in the spring. It is not a large operation. We have 4 staff, 2 of them lawyers, 1 investigator, 1 advocate who works directly with families. We partner with Legal Aid Ontario for cases involving clients without means. We operate a confidential intake line that is staffed during business hours and routes to an emergency contact after hours. The calls come in steadily. A woman in London whose stepson has moved her into his home and begun controlling her finances. A man in Ottawa whose daughter has his power of attorney and has been using it. A retired couple in Sudbury who are being pressured by a nephew to change their wills on a timeline that doesn't make sense. We help where we can. We refer where we can't. We document everything. Nadia volunteers on Saturday mornings. She has become, over the past year, one of the most effective intake advocates on the line because she understands from the inside how these conversations sound to the person being manipulated, how the concern sounds like love, how the control sounds like care, how you can live inside something false for years without seeing it clearly because you don't want to. She told me once that when a caller sounds the way she used to sound, careful, minimizing, instinctively defending the person who is hurting them, she feels a recognition that is almost physical. I know that voice, she said. I was that voice. Last month, a man called the intake line whose name I will not share. He was 78 years old. He was calling from a payphone because his son had taken his mobile phone for safekeeping. His son was also handling his banking, his grocery shopping, and his medical appointments. The man had not spoken to anyone outside the family in 4 months. He had called us because he had seen a notice in a library newsletter that Nadia had placed there 2 months ago. We sent an investigator within 48 hours. We connected him with a lawyer. Within 6 weeks, the son was facing a police investigation, and the man had moved to a supported living community of his own choosing, with his own phone, his own accounts, and a weekly call from Nadia. He sent us a handwritten note afterward. I have it on my desk. It says, "I did not think anyone would come. Thank you for coming." I read it on the mornings when the work is slow or complicated, or when a case doesn't go the way we hoped. I read it, and I think about the night of the Remembrance Day dinner, about the glass sitting in front of Alistair, about Spencer's face when he understood that the plan he had spent months constructing had closed around him instead of me. I think about Ellen, who spent 34 years as my partner, and who died believing I could look after myself. I intend to keep proving her right. If you've listened this far, I want to ask you something. Not about me, about you. Is there someone in your life who is being pressured, isolated, manipulated by people who are supposed to love them? An elderly parent who seems different lately? A neighbor who has stopped answering the door? Someone who flinches before they speak? Pay attention to that. Ask the question. Make the call. Because the people doing this are counting on everyone else to mind their own business. And I am counting on you not to.